It's only natural that we celebrate one of the strongest weapons in the Fate verse, the sword of promised victory, Excalibur. And today we got quite the list to go through. Some moments that you may have never even heard of. Let's get into it. Towards the end of Fate Zero, you have the confrontation between Saber and Gilgamesh, where Kiritsugu came out and forced Saber by the use of his command spells to destroy the Grail with her Excalibur. And you can tell that this is a real heartfelt scene just by looking at Saber's face and everything else that's going on. It went against everything that she stood for, because you know she is a living servant trying to obtain the Grail. This was that one definitive moment that just wrapped up the tragedy of Saber throughout the war. And in her background, it just seems like for the whole story of Zero, things just couldn't go her way. Her ideals were trampled upon. She ran into one of her own men, Lancelot, further fueling the trauma that she was trying to get away from. And then you have her not being able to work with her own master the entire time just because he refused to. So while the radiance around Excalibur is usually one of glory, this scene in particular can't help but be somber. Even Excalibur couldn't save her from that. Next up, we got one of the most memorable Excaliburs, and that is the one that Saber used against Jill in their battle. By this point, Jill had gained an upper hand on most of the characters in the show due to him summoning a higher dimensional being, thanks to his greater magecraft. There was nobody, and I do mean nobody, that was able to completely silence Jill but Saber and Gilgamesh. And even Gilgamesh was out of the question because he outright refused. That is, until Saber stepped in and started to release her seals. It really shows the weight of the circumstance where you watch all the characters, even the strongest, sit back in awe as Saber charges up her energy to defeat this monster. It's grandiose, it's radiant. It was such a huge moment that you can say that it encapsulates a part of the entire story. For all the time that they had spent struggling, it only took one well-prepared blast to turn Jill's monster into dust. Between the UB-Dub movie and the series, there was a point where we had to deal with the remnants of the manufactured Grail vessel. Leaving something like that to run rampant, and we would have been in for an equal amount of chaos as Gil winning. So the moment that Rin was able to get out to safety with Shinji, she used her command spell to force Saber to Excalibur the vessel, as well as disconnecting it from the Greater Grail. One of the earliest uses on the board is when we first ran into Gil at the park in the Fate route. Being that she was overwhelmed by the sheer amount of things Gil had in his Gate of Babylon, Saber couldn't help to opt to her Phantasm once he finally pulled out his Aya. The two of them go head up in a beam struggle, and even with the use of her Excalibur, the base power of his Aya was just too great, and he still was able to swallow her attack, leading into her defeat. You know how the saying goes, revenge is a dish best served cold. After Gil came out on top in their first confrontation, in their second bout, when Saber got her hands on Avalon, the odds started to change. By using the powers of Avalon in conjunction with her Excalibur, she was able to bypass Gil's Aya completely, show us a different variation of Excalibur where she charges it all into one hit instead of performing a blast, and straight up slice Gil directly down the center. You can even see that Gilgamesh tried to retaliate, but the charge time took way too long and Saber was still able to get hers off first. You got the fight between Saber and Medusa in the Fate route when they're fighting on the side of the skyscraper. While Saber was able to hang in there, Medusa was showing a clear advantage because she's used to this type of landscape. But this didn't become a real issue until they got to the rooftop, where Medusa brings out her Pegasus and Saber can't get to her entirely. Now she's stuck barrel rolling all over the place just for her to survive. The only problem is when Medusa devoted herself to one of her dives, it left her completely open to an attack. She charges up her Excalibur and completely annihilates Medusa and her Pegasus all at one time. You have the scene where Saber spent a chunk of her time chasing down who she perceived to be Iskander, and then she would later come to find out that Iskander wasn't even involved and Lancelot had actually pulled the wool over her. Considering Considering that she had built such a fond relationship with Maya in Irisville, you can tell that her conviction was heightened to match the gravity of the situation. By the time that she did finally catch up with Excalibur, she played no games with him, performing one of the quickest Excalibur charges that we've ever seen, immediately mincing his entire phantasm in an instant, just to show the difference in their level of power. And no, I'm not exaggerating. To put this into perspective, Excalibur was reinforcing his chariot with the lightning of Zeus. Again, he has divinity in his kit because he's recognized as a descendant of Zeus in verse. Even in the novel, it's said that he practically teleported in front of her and still couldn't reach her. Excalibur was lucky to escape with his life, and that was only by a thread. The use of Excalibur in the original Fate prototype will always be an interesting showcase just because it goes so much further than what we would see normally. You can see the original Proto-Gil ramping up to shoot his phantasm all the way from space, which would cause a flood over the entire city. And Arthur is more than prepared to outright counter this with one of his blasts. You can see just by the area of effect around Gil's phantasm just how much damage this would have done, the way that it hovered over the city. What usually gets scaled down for the story had turned into an Excalibur with identical scale that even put Gil in shock. The sheer magnitude of both phantasms just look incredible. You have the initial release of Gawain's holy sword, Galantine. This is something that took place in Fate Extra. Galantine's full name is Excalibur Galantine. While it does have different properties and functions from the original, it is said to be a sister sword of the first, which makes it an Excalibur as well. We see him begin with this classic sword toss-up, and once he's accumulated enough energy, he slams the entire thing down on Nero as well as the platform she's standing on, crushing the entire thing. Before she's even able to make a recovery, he follows this up with an even higher scale blast, landing a direct hit and knocking her out of the level. With the introduction of Salter in the Heaven's Field route, the audience gets shown time and time again just how ferocious Excalibur can be when it's not being held back by Saber's reserves, one of which being her face-off with Ryder. While Ryder is making many attempts to use her agility to weave around Salter, she becomes more tactful and more conservative with her Excalibur blast, and as you can see, those blasts become a lot more focused when she finally does let one bang loose. This next scene is regarded as a critical moment in Heaven's Field when Salter is using her Excalibur Vortigern. Thanks to Sakura being her master, she has an infinite pool of magical energy that she can pull from, and therefore she was spamming her Excalibur blast as much as she wanted to. There are many times where she would just outright incinerate the entire battlefield along with Hurt with it. This even made an addendum to the original novel where she took even more lives than she did initially. Heading off into the finale of the first season of Prisma Ilia, you have the fight between Miyu and Shadow Heracles, when she was using her Saber class card for the first time, in fact, to go up against him. As she slowly adapted to his fighting style, she became more comfortable with using the King Arthur class mechanics, and she was eventually able to let off her own blast of Excalibur, which took down one of Herc's lives. And then for the next one, you have another use. In that same fight, when things were starting to get overwhelming for Miyu, you had Ilya show up to give her a hand, both of them being in their magical form variants. With Ilya now in the mix, they both combined the Saber class card to their magical forms and let off a combined phantasm that utilized the Kaleidosticks and Excalibur at the exact same time. This resulted in an Excalibur blast that was multiple times over, but again, Prisma Ilia has its own rules and they took down Heracles for good. Hopping back into the time machine, we got a blast from the past, the fight that we had against Salter in Singularity F, or in other words, the beginning of Fate Grand Order. In this timeline, it was actually Salter who was the one that had defeated everybody in the war, and from then on, she was appointed to guard the Grail, and we were the ones that had to stop her. I'll never forget playing her in the game. She had wiped out my entire team because I took it for a joke. I even still have that video up to this day. It also served as a stepping stone to Mash understanding her own phantasm, Lord Camelot. Camelot, which was still unnamed at the time. A very impressive feat for her because since she's part Galahad, she was already blocking one of the strongest phantasms from the beginning with no experience. Moving on into the next one, I know a lot of people aren't up on game, but the times where Saber is the only one using Excalibur has long passed. You have the fight between Richard the Lionheart and Enkidu in Fate Strange Fate. The interesting thing about Richard the Lionheart is that due to the way his spirit is formed, anything he touches becomes Excalibur. And the hilarious thing about this scene is that while they were fighting in the forest, this man picked up a random tree branch, turned it to Excalibur, and let it fall on Enkidu, to the point where even Enkidu was impressed and started showing off more of his powers. For yet another Excalibur use, we have Richard the Lionheart summoning. The moment Richard the Lionheart came into the fray of Strange Fate, he just so happened to run into No Name Assassin, and she immediately started to go on the offensive. Everything was going pretty stable for her until she decided to use her phantasm Zabanya to go against Richard. The moment that Richard sensed this level of danger, he responded with his first use of Excalibur in the story, where he straight up decimated the entire roof of the theater that they were fighting in. No Name realized that he was so threatening that she decided to hit the escape button. For the next one, we have the use of Gawain using his Excalibur Galantine in the Camelot Singularity. In a fight that he had against Bedivere, he does his toss up, and the moment that he catches his sword, he's throwing huge towers of flame that span throughout the city, flame waves that melted anything that got in their way, and attacks that was slashing multiple buildings in half with one strike. Then to take this even further, in this same chapter you have the multiple times that Bedivere uses his Excalibur, his Ergetlan. So though it may not seem like it, this was an Excalibur versus Excalibur battle. You also have the times where he surprised Gawain with it previously in the story, completely disarming him of his own weapon. For our next one, we have an Excalibur use that should come to memory if you've been through Heaven's Field. It is the normal end where Shiro summons an image of Excalibur himself. Now, as I mentioned before, Excalibur is a divine construct, so him completely replicating the weapon is impossible, at least within the core timelines. But the story shows us that he can make a knockoff in his image. The cost, of course, was in return of his life. So if you've seen Heaven's Field, this deviation was the normal ending or the alternative ending to the true one that you saw in the movies. In this version, there was no safety net. There was no Ilya coming to save him. He sacrificed himself. The story ends with him taking down the Grail, and though he does save Sakura, it is a bittersweet ending where she's forced to live without him. A triumphant moment for Shiro, but a devastating conclusion for the world overall. Really love that take on this ending. You have Fate Extra Foxtail, where Gawain went up against Karna. While Karna was holding back due to his restrictions because he was trying to conserve his magical energy, he finally opted to using his Vasavi Shakti later on in the battle. This would then force the hand of Gawain and his master for him to use the Phantasm of Galantine, where he combined his numeral of the Saint, which is his buff from the sun, and the effects of his master to eat through Vasavi Shakti and put Karna down altogether. Crazy turnout considering how strong Karna is, but it just goes to show that it can happen if enough things are set in place. If I'm being honest, it's really just Apocrypha all over again. That man Karna cannot catch a break. Another one that we have comes from the chapter of Camelot, where we have Bedivere, who had devoted his entire life to bringing Excalibur back to his king, Artoria. By this point, Artoria had taken up the Rongo, which had fated her to be divine and continue wandering the planet as long as she held the weapon. In between his journey, you had Merlin fuse the actual Excalibur with his body in order to conceal it. Bedivere's unique phantasm, Ergetlan, where he switches on the effects of Excalibur through his own prosthetic arm. By the end of the chapter, he was able to return the sword to his rightful king after using this phantasm against her, and thus we had goddess Rongomenia relinquish her throne. In Prisma Ilya, you have the fight where Ilya went up against Julian Ainsworth, where he utilized both his displacement magecraft and the effects of Pandora's box alongside each other to overwhelm her. The thing about her using Excalibur here is that her path to victory wasn't clear and precise as it would be normally. She had to combine all the knowledge that she knew up until that point just to outmaneuver Julian and get around him. She started off in her Saber class card, used both the Rider and the Berserker cards for mobility, and then she returned to her Saber form to finally Excalibur him through the chest. A really hard fought battle in terms of strategy in her case, and a well-deserved win, no doubt. Next we have Strange Fate, and I gotta say, this is by far one of my favorites, the fight that Richard the Lionheart had against Gilgamesh. What makes this so incredible is that Richard, like a lot of other spirits, has no divinity in his kit. He's just an elevated human that's very skilled. And while Gil was pressing the idea that Richard would never reach him, not only was Richard able to get around his Gate of Babylon with him firing phantasms from every angle, but he also stole one of Gil's phantasms and combined his ability with it. Normally anything Richard turns into Excalibur would eventually fade away, but since the phantasm he stole from Gil was real, it was surrounded in the aura of the Age of the Gods, and he kept using it over and over again. And before you know it, this man had used over 20 Excaliburs on Gil in a row, lifting him all the way into the sky, until finally he ran out of gas himself. And at that point, the ball was in Gil's court again. And although the power of Richard's Excalibur can't reach the level of the real one, it's still impressive nonetheless. One of our most recent uses of Excalibur, and one that I feel like has usurped the title for iconic over Fate Zero, is the one that we have in Lost Belt 6 of FGO, where Artoria Avalon comes in to save us. In this fight, you have her going up against Sir Nunnos, the Great Calamity of Norwich. There's so many things to be said about this moment, it deserves its own video. But putting it lightly, Sir Nunnos is capable of destroying the entire planet, and by combining the effects of Rongomenia and Excalibur that's associated with her origin, she was able to take him down at the cost of her sacrifice. Everything that she stood for boiled down to her completing this task, putting down all of the curses of Avalon, as well as fulfilling her destiny to save the world itself. One of the biggest moments for Excalibur indeed. You know I couldn't forget this one. Though this has also yet to be animated, we have the wielder that went up against the White Titan Safar 14,000 years ago, who was also said to be using Excalibur at the time. The White Titan, being a calamity that wiped out all of Earth, ran through the Olympian pantheon in pan-human history, had Zeus and the machine gods scrambling just for a tie in Lost Belt history, and is even stronger than the same Sir Nunnos that I mentioned before. To this day, we still don't know who that wielder is. It's one of the deepest lores of the Nasuverse. Can't wait to find out. It's been a long time in the making. For some honorable mentions, we'll start with a fight that takes place in the prequel to Fate Prototype, that being Prototype Fragments, where King Arthur goes up against the Beast of 666 summoned by Monica. During the fight, you have him call upon the true powers of Excalibur. He makes an attempt to unlock the 13 seals, a condition where the Knights of the Round actually have to approve the attack. He's able to reach Bedivere, Palamedes, Lancelot, Mordred, Galahad, and of course one of his votes was himself. And although he wasn't able to get the full Knights of the Round Table, you had the other half of the servants from the war, people like Ozzy for instance, who respected Arthur enough to lend him a hand and make up for the other half of the remaining strength. They did this more so on a spiritual level, since they had already been defeated by this point in time. And at that point he was finally able to take the beast down before it was completely born. But he could only seal it because he didn't use the full phantasm. Mind you that he was holding Monica's sister, Ayaka, in his left arm while he was doing this. As you know, Arthur has this strict rule about leaving one of his arms open while he fights for moments just like this one. Really dope scene that we must see animated. Again, another one from Prototype Fragments. You have the fight between Ozzy against Arash and King Arthur at the same time. By this point, Ozzy had summoned his own temple, the Ramazim, and he had got an upper hand on the both of them. Unfortunately, there came a point where Ozzy was running out of energy himself due to the lack of him having a master. So in a last ditch effort, he used his phantasm, the Dendera bulb, to charge up his Ramazim and try to take them both out at the same time with the power of his temple. Arash and Arthur responded by combining both of their phantasms into one unique attack. So not only is this a great moment for Excalibur, but it's one of the only true conjoined phantasms in the series. Arash shoots out his Stella, and at that point the phantasms merge and they use this new phantasm to take out Ozzy for good. Then we have another moment from Prisma Ilya, and no, this isn't just an image where you have Ilya transform into her Kuro variant and project an actual Excalibur. This is a real projection like Emiya does in the timelines of Fate Extra. This is something that's further clarified in her materials, and it's only available to Ilya. Using this, she was able to defeat a class card version of Salter in a head-on Excalibur versus Excalibur collision. An epic moment for the books, and this is just when Prisma Ilya was getting started. To throw in yet another epic moment for Prisma, you have the real Kuro projecting an image of Excalibur. This is Ilya's counterpart, by the way. She eventually separated and gained her own body. This time around, instead of using it for its blast, she actually uses Excalibur as an arrow and shoots Gil directly through his defenses. Between the shock factor and the build up, it really made her mark that she's a character full of surprises. Both in the manga and anime, the scene was just amazing to look at. Be sure to drop in some of your favorite moments, and we're definitely gonna keep doing stuff like this.